Welcome to this week's edition of Done and Dusted. I'm joined by my fellow podcaster, Darren Mort, an esteemed barrister, author, but also filmmaker. So welcome, Darren.
Hello, Caroline. Welcome back to you too, and Happy New Year.
Thank you very much. And our guest this week is Dr. Jayne Meyer, who's going to be really talking about the difficulties faced by families who are disadvantaged, but also how we can make a difference for families in relation to decision making. And we thought we'd start with a bit of a theme this year of meet them where they are, which is really about taking families as we find them, regardless of what their challenges are. So, Jayne, we might kick off with you by getting you to explain to us a bit about, well, what is Family Connect? What is it that you do, and what has been your journey?
Well, first of all, Happy New Year to all, and I agree we can keep saying that for, I think, forever and a day. I will just do a very brief outline of Volunteer Family Connect, but before I do that, I do need to outline that the actual program is now being overseen by an organisation called Caritini, and the actual research and ongoing research is being led and overseen by the University of Western Sydney, particularly Professor Rebecca Grace. And there is a very good reason why I mention how the two organisations have moved on with the collaboration, because Volunteer Family Connect actually is a structured home visiting program. So it's a way of bringing people together at the local level. But for it to become its own entity, it actually went through a decade, and I mean a decade, I mean 10 years, of a collaborative group. Now, the collaborative group did change a little along the way, but it was basically three major not-for-profits, and Caritini was part of that, and a couple of universities, but the prime driver university was the University of Western Sydney. And we also had some of the, and I'll say some because they also appeared at different stages of the Big Four. And it was all a $6 million funded randomized or pragmatic randomized controlled trial by an anonymous donor. So it had all of the mixings of a group of people that really never always got together on a project, and over that decade worked very hard to achieve a world first pragmatic randomized controlled trial. Now, this whole conversation that we're going to have is not about research. It's about the experiences, I suppose, I gleaned in that decade, where I had this wonderful role of being able to almost like, I use the phrase herding cats, but it's actually bringing people together. The phrase was a Volunteer Family Connect champion. And what my role was to do was to enable everything to run smoothly from all of the corners of the various different parts of sectors that were involved. And that ranged from funding issues to enabling, at times, particular research that needed to be done, whereas programs needed to be designed. And, you know, that part of it is where it's very interesting to go further into the research that Rebecca has done. So
Jayne,
yeah.
What gets in the way of us helping families? What got in the way in relation to volunteering to help families who were in crisis, remained in crisis? What were the learnings? What are the takeaways?
Yeah, and I'm going to actually start and turn that question around and say the secret sauce of what we learned in the 10 years, because prior to that, in my 30 years of working in the sector, had never had the opportunity to work in a collaboration that went over a decade. And what we did learn is that whenever we hit the difficult times or the awkward conversations that had to be had, the key criteria was the child first. So what actually happens in communities where there's dysfunction in the family unit, or basically things just aren't going as well as they could be, and unfortunately getting at the point where authorities may need to step in and take leadership, The volunteer role could not play at that, what I call the sharp end, but what they could do is try and do some of the preventative work and enabling the families to have a smoother experience and less dysfunction. Sometimes just being able to order your day and enabling to get the kids to school on time can really make a big difference. And that's where the volunteer could have the best effect. But why doesn't that happen often is quite often the organisations are fighting amongst themselves, or particularly funding is a bit of a driver there. But in this 10 years, we actually had the absolute commitment towards the child being first and what needed to be happening in that community, and what was the research that had to be done to better understand the volunteers' role. And so I'll just say one more thing, which I think is really important in our learnings, and that is that you cannot have a volunteer, and I think I've used this phrase before, people don't go into families with a very clear, families presenting themselves with a very clear checklist of, oh, you know, I've got these issues and this issues and this issues, and we need X, Y, Z. The volunteer role was to actually be able to go in and know when they needed to step out, meaning when it was serious and then authorities needed to step in, or services pending education, health or social care of skilled operators.
So Darren and I are very familiar with the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. And really what you're talking about is how do you wrap care around a family that otherwise might be unraveling, to ensure that there is that child-focused solution for them. And imagine if we did that more diligently across the board. So presumably that was one of the preferred outcomes. How can we actually step in and assist families, regardless of whether they're united or separated? It doesn't matter, because if you're child-focused, and as we said, you take the family as you find them, you meet them as they are. You don't reinvent them in the way we prefer them to be. Darren, your experience of families in crisis, you and I at various times despair, and we think, God, if only these families had had the right care at the right time from whatever sources they could get, local councils, mental health care providers, doctors, educators.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many organisations doing a lot for families, but often too late, despite their good intentions. And I'm really interested to ask you, Jayne, you spoke of prevention. What sort of preventative measures do you implement through this organisation?
Well, first of all, I suppose this is where, for me, the conversation I'd like to sort of really focus on here is, how do you get a group of organisations who aren't from the same sector to actually play in the ballpark? Because that for me is the biggest message I feel I was very fortunate to have gained over that 10 years. I used to say to the group, you know, none of us now, we've all been tainted. We've all been, and I say nicely tainted, because we've all had that experience of what happens when you do work together. When the child does come first, when you are able to maybe get over some of the funding squabbles. And I think that the key thing is relationships, obviously. You know, once you've actually decided or agreed as a group that the child focused is going to be the very first decision-making parameter, you then have to work on your relationships. There's a wonderful phrase, it's not mine, and I can't off the top of my head state who is it from, but it's move at the speed of trust. And I could not say that, you know, that was so evidenced over that decade, because if we were having issues, or if there were, and I again use the phrase prickly bits at times, what we would do is come back to, okay, why are we here? Or what are the issues that we need to really move through, and not rush it. Now, there were times when the research did have to have some pace on. And again, there were many, many times when, if we hadn't had the communication levels regularly happening, we probably wouldn't have navigated some of that. So, you know, relationships, people, communication, they all sound, in actual fact, they're free. You know, they're actually free. They don't cost anything, and they make a big difference. But there's one other part of this equation that, and it's not in any way a pointing finger to the government, albeit they tend to be the main funder at times. It's possibly anyone who's holding those funding strings. Don't set the funding forward in a way that encourages the competition or the inability to work with each other. Because it's almost like as soon as those funds are let out the gate with that label on them, it's really almost impossible for organisations to put their own needs aside. So what we did experience in this 10-year window, because the funding had been distributed with a very clear outline that you as a collective are going to create this program, roll it out, test it, and have a story to tell, that made a massive difference. So
and collaborative solutions are always better than siloed thinking. I think we'd have to be in heated agreement about that.
But I think it's, sorry.
Well, I was going to say it's fantastic you got funding, because I think there's a lot of spin doctor stuff that happens with funding. And I think also depending on relations that have already been formed between people in those positions who are authorising those funds, it seems that there's a distribution of preferred funds to organisations because of those relationships, where other particular organisations are overlooked or not provided for adequately. And I think your measure, Jayne, is probably a really good one in terms of collaboration, because it adds all these extra voices. Yeah.
To me, you hit the nail on the head. The funding is with the relationship with the organisation and the funder.
Yeah.
Well, hold on a minute. What about if the funding was the relationship with the requirement? In our situation was the child and dysfunctional families, and how volunteers could actually help them be more supported, which enables the community to help themselves. Well, what if that was where the funding drive was going to, and the vehicle is the organisations involved? You know, it's not necessarily the relationship at that point. The relationship's more at that local level. And again, I'm probably going to not go into too much detail on that, because my PhD was around that, and I feel very strongly about how, if you are really trying to make change at the local level, then involve them. You know, don't do to, do with. And if you're doing with, you therefore are going to be making some very different decisions.
And
yes,
Darren and I are very aware of those organisations that put their hand out repeatedly for the same renewal of funding as if it's expected year after year. But I'm not sure the rigour is put around, well, what deliverables are you in fact achieving? And again, it goes back to, well, we want it so we can survive. We're not terribly interested in addressing the problem as a whole, but just the part of the equation that we want to have funding for. And that's exactly, as I understand it, that what you were trying to get away from, and instead re-engineer result based on child need, which is music to our ears, isn't it, Darren?
Oh, absolutely. Hey, Jayne, I'm interested too. Who are these volunteers? I mean, I don't want names, but who are these people? Where do they come from?
Well, very, very, when I say this wonderful phrase, normal, very normal people, but interestingly, quite often they would become the people who had been helped. Now, this is amazing, because one of the reasons that the whole concept of Volunteer Family Connect got its impetus was because organisations who were working with volunteers, who do have this great place to play at that preventative early stage before the dysfunction of a family happens, or at the other end when people are starting to put their lives back together. In other words, when the authorities have actually stepped out and things are safe to be moving forward. But what actually happened was that the volunteers that organisations were using actually were empowered and had got into their own thought process of, well, I want to give back to my community, and became volunteers themselves. But they didn't stop there, because then they would go on to think, okay, well, I could actually become educated. in a particular area that, you know, previously maybe they had never thought of, and gone on and done other qualifications. And so what was happening was the volunteer pool was getting less and less. So it was like it was almost like a wonderful reason to have to look at how we can encourage volunteering and expand it.
Yeah, Caroline and I were on I think they called it the Domestic Violence Task Force Committee, reporting to the Royal Commission on Family Violence a few years ago. And we were surrounded by a multitude of organisations, heads of these organisations, doing amazing stuff. But I walked away from that thinking how powerful it would be if there was more collaboration, because I think what you said before is so true, Jayne, that everyone there was fighting for the buck. And there's a lot of money that goes out there to these organisations spreading awareness, but there's not many organisations like yours in terms of hand-on and in the employment of preventative measures with that hands-on work. And that's what, I don't know, that's what I lament over sometimes. I think it's a real shame that, you know, you don't get more attention from that like these other organisations do with awareness, because I think a lot of the money, like I'm probably talking off my hat, but a lot of the money seems to go to employing people administratively to run these organisations, rather than putting money where it should, such as child clothing, education, basic things, where that money could be more usefully employed. What do you think about that?
I love you, Darren, because I was actually going to reflect on our experience when I initially set up that organisation, and I'm thinking of one particular organisation that year puts its hand out, gets the funding, Jayne, but doesn't necessarily justify that it's achieving or delivering that which it says that it is. And
I'm going to be a bit of a devil's advocate in the way that this conversation is going, from the point of view that, as with any organisation, a charity, a not-for-profit, has to have staff to have oversight of whatever the deed or whatever the cause of what they're about. I can't argue that enough, that it's ever so important. And in the Volunteer Family Connect, one of the major points that we were able to evidence was that if there hadn't been a coordinator and an overseer of the volunteer role, you would have been in danger of volunteers entering into areas, if they weren't debriefing at the end of having a family visit, that you could be at risk of somebody being involved in something that was not their, you know, when I say not their business, it was something that needed to be referred to other agencies. So I want to make that point really strongly. But the second one I wanted to sort of be a bit of a devil's advocate with is that, yes, it's great to have clear outcomes, because that's what happened for us as a group. It was in 2012, and I remember when we got together and said, look, we've got this opportunity. We all feel strongly that we're often told funding can't go towards volunteering because there is no valid research in the world. Let's be the research. Let's put it on the map. Let's do it. And what do we need, etc. And we really had to sort of put aside many of our structures in the organisations to enable it to get to where it got in the decade onwards. But had we been given a request of that funding at that point in time, that, yeah, okay, we can have the funding and you have to have done A, B, C, and D in detail, I don't think we would have got there. But what enabled us to get there was the task ahead of you is to put to research volunteering and design a program that can be used by multiple groups. And you may find that volunteering may not work, but it's not until we step into this space, you know, anecdotally we all knew it did, but we were testing it at a randomized controlled trial. It means that it's the greatest scientific research that you can do. So it was really being tested. And then I think the key takeout for me around that particular point is sometimes the granular of you must achieve these outcomes by the funding or however the direction is being issued can stifle it. So yes, you need the clear framework of what we want to achieve. Let's say all services to be child-centered or child-centric in their design. And here's funding. What are you then going to do for us gives you a little bit more of a flexibility to meet the community where they are, rather than some imposed cookie cutter frameworks that don't work in Darwin, as they definitely won't work in places in Victoria. You know, it's sort of.
I think in Darren's defence and mine, it's what we're actually talking about is a cookie cutter. And thank you for giving us that phrase. It is an organisation that has a cookie cutter,
right,
and it puts its hand out to run that cookie cutter every single year without demonstrable benefits. And it's become sort of like the gold standard of, this is what you must do if there is family violence. And I think that's right, Jayne. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think we're coming at it from the same angle, but via a different part of the conversation. I think you do have to keep an open mind. I think you do need to work out, well, is there a better way we can do this? Is there a more collaborative way? And don't get the end result lost in that equation. So if in fact we think it's a great thing for us as a country to be a signatory in relation to the International Convention on the Rights of Children, and if we believe there are certain outcomes that we all desire for children, then re-engineer or reverse engineer, how do we get there? How do we achieve that aim in these situations, taking into account all the possible permutations, but also engineer, well, what does that family require? Some families might not need certain access to certain information or certain support groups.
Very, very much so. And I think that just reflecting on that decade, and a decade's a long time, and a changing in a family's needs. I mean, it went through the pre-COVID, and it kind of finished at the crux of COVID as well. And that was a really good example of how you can have a major change. I mean, COVID wasn't just a local issue, domestic in Australia, as we all know. It was a global issue that we all had to navigate, probably for the first time in all of our lives. And the strength of the collaboration and the focus on the outcomes and the ability for each organisation to do its own thing, but also keep connected together, was again another interesting part of this whole journey that we had. We had finished the research at that point in time, and were designing the actual program, hoping to actually be able to have some even helpful conversations with some of the funders that are out there in the land about how maybe they could go down that pathway that you're sort of suggesting, Caroline, that it becomes re-engineered and thinking about how things are done. I can't say we were 100% successful with that, but the future of the program has lived on through the, as I say, Caritini, and through the research of University of Western Sydney.
Jayne, how do these families come to your attention?
Well, again, not for me. In each organisation, they all had their own different ways of how they had a touch base with the community. Some of them had strong connections with health, and so a health professional would meet a family, and they would decide that they could refer them into, and maybe it's all referrals. So it was really touch points with people.
Yep.
And various different experiences, from a social care sort of element. They may have had social workers on their teams, and they would likewise. And if you think of the education setting, there may have been an older sibling at school, and there was a younger child that wasn't going to playgroup or whatever because a mum's life or father's life is just so hectic. Yep. So and I'm sure in the research there would be a very good and very detailed answer to that, because there was a major significant finding, and I don't know how much you're aware of the words or the phrase significant finding in randomized controlled trials. You're very lucky if you get them. And we actually had two. And one of the major significant findings was that the community members, when they've had experience of a volunteer, felt more empowered that they could do things. So that's such an important finding, because what that meant was, the longevity of that family, their trajectory had changed. It's obviously that life's going to happen and things will occur, I know, But in that window of time, things could have got a lot worse. So it,
Yeah.
each family would have interacted with their organisations in a different way, and that's good as well, because that means that they could come into the settings of the Volunteer Family Connect program, and then where it would be probably more aligned and following a certain procedure of how to do things, because there had to be those frameworks around it, not just for the research, but for the, again, protection of the volunteer, protection of the family. That's when all the organisations followed the process of how to be running a Volunteer Family Connect program.
So in other words, demonstrating capacity for problem solving to the actual family, that you're basically empowering them by showing that they can in fact find a way through difficulty and challenges. That I find that fascinating.
And it's also great, isn't it? And it makes you, or begs you, to ask the question, just imagine if we were able to remove these funding silos and organisations were set up to work collectively together with the key focus, in our case of what we're talking here, the child-centric approach. Just imagine what is possible.
Absolutely. I'm interested to perhaps now talk about, based on what we've heard, and it's an amazing body of work, I'm interested to hear, is the future in safe hands? Bearing in mind, you mentioned there was a philanthropist involved, and that you can't continue to rely on the goodwill of others to make this sort of thing happen. Were you able to get that to that breakthrough point and demonstrate value to enable that longevity and ongoing funding?
Look, I'm going to be the bold person that says this, because I'm not attached as to the organisations where other people, and this what's the point that we've been speaking about. It's you have to play a game sometimes to keep yourselves in the loop. But I think the key thing that I want to say here is that we had all set into this process believing, having heard on numerous occasions, that you really have to have a randomized controlled trial to bring the evidence to the table for, funding to obviously follow where that evidence comes forward. Well, that's the bit for me that got let down, because the policies either changed or funding was, fair enough. I have to accept the whole country and world was going through a major sort of experience from the COVID scenarios. So I think that was one of the letdowns. But the great advice and of the philanthropist, who obviously has got a very skilled operator in other areas, was a great coaching for the group, for everyone involved, that just because you may not have got the Mercedes or the Rolls Royce of what you wanted, you can always find the mini or the smaller car sort of version in it. So it was just a great way of reminding us all that you can't lose this 10 years. You can't lose the program. It's done. It works. Find a way to make it happen in your location. So all of the organisations involved, I use that phrase again, were nicely tainted, and it still continues in their organisations in different ways.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Jayne. And just last thoughts, Darren. Your take out.
Whoops, am I off mute? I'm just checking.
No, you're fine.
I think of that phrase, prevention is better than cure, but sometimes I think prevention is the cure, isn't it? And when you've got a situation with the power of a number of bodies coming together collaboratively with one focus, with the kid in the spotlight, I just don't think there's any other answer. I think it's such a positive way forward. And it really brings people's focus into light in terms of what really matters and what we're all on about, and how we can make real differences to these people, because even a modest change, even a modest input by the volunteers involved can make such a huge impact, not only to the child, but to the family. you know, and just having that support. So yeah, very interesting talking to you, Jayne. Yeah.
And Jayne, in terms of your decade and your journey, what was the major takeout for you?
Look, the relationship, do not underestimate the importance of relationships. Just don't underestimate it. It is, we're all humans. And if the groups that you're endeavoring to collaborate with, it seems that there's some kind of awkwardness in the relationship, take the time to understand, spend the time to get to grips with it, spend the time. And the other thing, I suppose, what I've picked up from some of the conversations we're having with that cookie cutter, maybe we all need to be cookie cutter ambassadors, meaning we need to stand up and say, oh, that's a cookie cutter scenario when we see them. And, test to see if it's actually sitting and fitting right for the needs of the community, again, in this case, the child.
Well, thanks for that, Jayne. And for me, it's similar to Darren. I see the power of collaborative action, and I see how you can shift a situation through positive focus and working together rather than against each other. And often in our field, and that's at family law, where families are often at their worst, when we have people working together to really achieve the best possible outcome and remain child focused. So that's the other big thing that sometimes get lost in our neck of the wood when we're representing a parent. I would like us to take that collaborative message. I would like us as family law practitioners, if they're watching this, and indeed for the parents that are watching this, to think about how you can park what you want and ensure that everything you're doing is coming from the right place, and that's to promote the welfare of the child. So thank you so much, Dr. Jayne Meyer Tucker, for joining us on Done and Dusted. You can watch this podcast on LinkedIn, and you can also watch it on YouTube. So thanks, everybody, for participating tonight.
Thank you.